Welcome to my presentation. You see, when most people think about language, they think about spoken language, but of course, language is irregardless of form. And so I would like to focus on a different kind of language, sign language. The main difference, of course, being the modality of this language. Whereas spoken language is oral and auditorial, sign language is gestural and visual. And for this reason, the difference in modality, people who are deaf or hard of hearing are the main people who use sign language and that we associate sign language with. Indeed, that was the original reason for the invention of sign language. But I would like to look at different people who could benefit from the language of a different modality. You see, I myself am autistic, so that kind of has me interested in neurodivergence and I guess thus psychology, or at least that aspect of society or of psychology mainly. Um, but also, I'm also interested in language as well. And the main reason for this, I would say, is that I learned French for family reasons, and that got me interested in language in general, not just French. And then when we think about how does language work with the brain, or even more interestingly enough, neurodivergent brains, interesting. So I would like to look at how can sign language be applied to people with language disorders, rather than just those who have a perceptual inability. So there's many ways we could have sign language as a tool. The main ways that I identify are that sign language can make language more comprehensible, i.e. comprehensible input. It can make expressing oneself maybe potentially easier, so it can be a way for someone to express themselves. They can express themselves in sign language as opposed to spoken language, like usual. Or it can also be a research tool, because sign language, as I've seen from looking at all these papers and more importantly studies, that using sign language, given as a different modality, can tell us more about the way the brain works when we talk about certain conditions or disorders. So let's get into comprehensible input. So one thing is mentioned in this article back from 2022, which is quite recent, but it's a literature review. So it actually looks at articles back from 1980 to more current, more present. But it's important to keep in mind that some of the studies looked at in this article might contain or do contain archaic ways of diagnosing autism, understanding autism, because it's important to note that the definition of autism has not been static over the years. Anyways, the article is called Usage of Sign Language with Autistic Children, a Literature Review. So the main thing that I found here, which relates to comprehensible input, is simultaneous communication. They talk about simultaneous communication, which they refer to as the learning system, the most documented learning system they found in all of their literature that they reviewed. And so what simultaneous communication is when you speak and you sign at the same time. But the sign language would not be following the grammar of the sign language, would be following more so the grammar and the syntax of the vocal language. Because, for example, in the US, English does not have the same grammar as ASL. So if you wanted to learn ASL from simultaneous communication with English, you would not. You would learn signs, but you wouldn't learn ASL grammar. So you'd be learning some parts, some aspects of the language, but you effectively would be learning that language. But we're not trying to teach ASL with simultaneous communication. The point here mainly is to make input comprehensible, to make speech comprehensible. So the fact that this is actually effective, because not only was documented, is also reported very overwhelmingly, is overwhelmingly showing positive outcomes for expression in the autistic children. So this actually brings up some questions, because earlier theories of people like Dr. Meltzer and other people that they bring up talk about how autism, the way it's supposedly comprehending sensory information, is that you basically keep the senses separate, so that they don't live in a constant state of simultaneously experiencing all five senses and such. And so therefore you might think that also the different senses don't talk to each other as much in the autistic mind, and therefore you would think that a unimodal type of communication would be better suited. However, this is not the case, as I already mentioned, because it's actually positively associated with expressive outcomes later on. So therefore, you can put forth the hypothesis that maybe the children's comprehension of the oral language helps them understand the sign language, or that sign language, which these children in most of the studies don't know, the sign language would actually help a little bit understand the vocal language, because after all, spoken language is just a bunch of sounds. And so the way we comprehend spoken language is basically by considering all the possible interpretations of the sounds, and which we deduce via context. So the more context you have, the less guesswork you have to do, and the more sure you can feel in what's the right interpretation. So sign language would be added context, especially because sign language is pictorial in most cases. So for example, if I'm talking about tea, I'm talking about the drink. I'm talking about tea, I'm talking about the letter. But this is not as pictorial because it's sign language lettering. But I mean, this, for example, does resemble the letter in English L. So that probably would be picked up by the autistic children in those studies, I would assume, or just autistic people who know English or don't know sign language. But anyways, good input leads to good output, which is why simultaneous communication leads to more expressive outcomes in children later on. Another thing to consider is also, by looking at this other study, we can think about types of gesturing, because right now we're talking about use of gesture or sign language in aiding in expressive comprehension. And so so the main thing from this study, which was done in 2022, same year, very recent, which has Cantonese speaking caregivers and children, autistic children, and they look at how well basically different ways of communication with different kinds of gesturing, how well those different kinds of gesturing works in the children's later expressive language later on, positively, negatively correlated. And so therefore what kinds of gestures might be more or less effective. And so the main kinds of gestures that they found that was effective sometimes depends on context. So they look at multiple kinds of gestures, but the main gestures to look at, I would say, are deictic gesturing, because those had the most results. In deictic gestures, what those are is when you draw attention to something. So the most common version, the most common example of this would be pointing to something. Water bottle, right? I brought attention to it, then I used expressive language to explain what it was that was pointed to. And so when children use dictate gesturing, and then the adult used expressive language, that combination more specifically was positively correlated to expressive outcomes for the autistic children. And you could think of this because you bring attention to an object or whatever it is, and then so you create a subject, and then the parent talks over it, which creates comprehensible input because one, the child is paying attention, two, the child has context, and so that helps them understand the expressive language. That is a positive use of gesture in this case. What was negatively associated was actually when the parents use dictate gesturing, and you can assume that this is because when the parent is using dictate gesturing, you effectively bypass using expressive language because then it's no longer necessary for communication. And if you're using those kinds of gesturing while you're speaking, the child doesn't really need to pay attention to the speech. They can pay attention to your gestures and not therefore pick up the language as much. So that's interesting because we were talking about simultaneous communication, in which gesturing, albeit gesturing is not exactly maybe not how most people would use the word gesturing because gesture is usually not referring to a full-on blown-out language, a legitimate language. But if you use simultaneous communication, it helps. Use dictate gesturing does not help. It does the opposite, has the opposite effect. So it's important to note that dictate gesturing does not equal sign language, and the kind of gesturing matters in creating more or less comprehensible input, or at least input that will lead to expressive language later on. Now, autism bilingualism. Let's talk about people with language disorders and their ability to actually use sign language. So first, let's go with autism because actually for this whole presentation I'll just cover autism, and I'll cover another language disorder, but mainly I cover autism. And the thing about autism is that it is a spectrum, so there isn't exactly one version of autism. So I wouldn't be surprised if later on in autism we define many different kinds of language disorders within autism instead of just saying, oh, there's one language disorder in autism, because it is such a varied spectrum, literally. So, but this study covers autism bilingualism and how it is, how basically, how is positive and shouldn't be discouraged as much as it historically has been. This paper is back in 2022. Apparently, a lot happened in 2022. Clearly, three things happened in 2022. These sources, and it's just an article, it's not a study that was posted in The Psychologist. So historically, people with language disorders or disabilities like autism have been discouraged from learning other languages that are not the majority language. So, right, if you have a family that's from Mexico, for example, the mom speaks Spanish, the child is growing up in the United States, you might hear a school saying, they're disabled. I think they'll get the languages confused and then discourage learning Spanish, and they don't learn Spanish because different professionals think that it's a bad idea, including, as this article talks about, speech language pathologists. Come on. But also a lot of schools and other professions, which is really weird because it does not follow the research. It's not an opinion all that based on research. Bilingualism does not appear to be impossible or that the children will confuse all the languages. Bilingualism has been reported as being beneficial to autistic children, both in cognitive and social domains. One of the things that bilingualism or multilingualism, whatever it is, can help with is actually in set shifting task, as they put it, as they name it in the article, which would have to do with executive function, because which is a thing that is often affected in autism and ADHD as well. If you need to understand what executive functioning is, it's so many different kinds of things that could be executive functioning. But in any case, this specific kind of executive functioning that has been reported in many different sources to be one of the main benefits of bilingualism is that your prefrontal cortex is able to kind of shift context. So as it says, set shifting tasks, what it basically refers to is when context change. So for example, if you're speaking to your classmates, let's say you're a bilingual child, your mom speaks Spanish, you're going to class, there are a bunch of English speakers, so you're not going to consider using Spanish. I mean, it depends on what school you go to, but let's just assume a bunch of white people, they speak English. So you're not going to consider the Spanish. Your brain's going to say, that's not relevant information. We're only going to consider this. And so as I was saying earlier, with vocal language, we interpret vocal language. And so, right, this is another set of context. And this part of the brain is actually increased when we are bilingual. Additionally, bilingual people have a greater vocabulary, and not just bilingual people, the autistic bilingual children have a greater vocabulary and tend to speak more and use more gestures, which is interesting. They're more expressive in general. You see, when it comes to criticisms for bilingualism, the thing is, even autistic children, by learning more languages, you're just gonna have a greater vocabulary. It's not that you have a set fixed vocabulary, and that by learning another language, you're using up storage that can't be expanded. That's not how this works. You have people, including neurodivergent people, who are polyglots and speak five languages super fluently. So yeah, bilingualism is not impossible. In fact, actually, it might be more likely to see the positive benefits from bilingualism than any sort of setbacks that come from taking the extra time to learn a second language. Now let's go into some another language disorder other than autism. Autism is a language disorder. It's just that language disorder is often associated with autism. But let's look at signing in individuals with developmental language disorder. That's what DLD stands for. And so this was done even more recently. It's a study done in 2023 that it looks at autistic children children with DLD and neurotypical children. If you don't know what neurotypical means, neurotypical refers to people whose brains are wired typically. Neuro referring to neurological, neurotypical, normal brain. Right, so that would be the control group effectively for this study. And so what they found with these children is that so the thing is, DLD is associated with phonological issues, and phonology does not specifically refer to, like, if you might think about phone, and then you think, oh, sound. So phonology has to do with sound. No, it doesn't. It has to do with aspects of language. So if artists use the plural in English, really, what's usually the plural, though not always, because English is a weird language. I say phone and phones. The z indicates it's plural, and that is phonological. That is an addition. That is a phonological aspect. So even so, sign language also has phonology, though it is just hand shape, the orientation and the direction. So for example, if I were to say me in ASL, I mean probably just I don't probably other languages too because this is very basic. But if I say me, this is me. I point at myself. If I say you, I point at you. But so this would indicate that if you have DLD, you might accidentally point at you instead of pointing to oneself when you're trying to say me. Then also in the study, it had to do with hearing children who didn't know sign language at all, and they're only going to teach them 4 signs. So you can't study any actual linguistic really information so much, but more so just their ability to sign or to articulate signs. And therefore would be just only gestural, not linguistic. So here's the signs that they taught. And so what we found is that children with DLD have the full range of motion. They can theoretically, as you'd say, theoretically perform all of these signs. The difficulty for them, though, was the coordination. When you have signs that have, like, for example, the eponymometer, you have hands moving in opposite directions. This can be difficult for someone with DLD, and they falter. So that's what we learned, basically, from this study, is that when it comes to actually using sign language, some people have difficulty with the coordination with it, which says something about the prospects of people with certain language disorders potentially using sign language as a way of communicating for them. Not looking so good. So how do autistic people sign? Well, one aspect that was studied in this study back in 2017, our first somewhat late study, looks at echolalia in deaf children who are autistic. So I don't know if it's specifically native signers, but anyways, they found that those deaf autistic signers still had echolalia, even though it was sign language, not spoken language. So what is echolalia? Echolalia has to do with basically repeating language. And so there are multiple kinds of echoes, such as pure or mitigated echoes. A pure echo is when you copy language word for word exactly, and mitigated language is when you conjugate or put a spin on, or you change some part about that copied language. You modify it in some way. And so echolalia is actually associated with people who basically just have low language comprehension scores. And so it's not just an autistic thing. It's more so when you have poor language reception. And so that's why you can actually see people, if they gain or if they more so lose an ability to understand language receptively, you'll see them begin to start using echolalia. And conversely, those who get better at receptive language, you'll see them stop using as much echolalia, or they'll go from pure echoes to more mitigated echoes, and then eventually from mitigated echoes to not echoing, I guess. So so it's just a feature of language. It's not specific to audio or visual domains or modalities. It's simply a linguistic trait. And one thing that's somewhat interesting is that the thing about sign language echoing is that it is actually possible to echo while the other person is speaking because of the modality, right? You're not actually interrupting them if you sign, whereas in audio, it would make it disruptive and you wouldn't be able to understand the other person saying as you're saying something so much, or it would be at least disruptive enough to be problematic a lot of the time. So, and then also with echolalia, autism being associated with echolalia indicates that autism might be related to poor language reception ability, and therefore he might think that things like simultaneous communication might be more called for when it comes to people who are autistic. And then another point that I can bring up is that you can the thing is this echolalia, it is repeating what someone's saying. So when it comes to if you were to theorize, what if someone said something and then you sign it to help yourself understand? That's what echolalia does, is it helps you understand language receptively and process the language. So could you use sign language to help process language even with spoken, and you can't actually literally replicate spoken language in sign? Well, for that I have more anecdotal evidence. My friend back in high school, he took ASL and started learning how to fingerspell very well and really fast. And what he would do, and he's also autistic, is that when someone's speaking, he would fingerspell some of the words that they were saying, but he kind of said it was meaning like a tick. So I don't know if it necessarily was being used to help comprehension. Though I know for myself, though, if someone is spelling something to me particularly, I like fingerspelling it. So if they're like, oh, it's spelled this way, and it just goes out one ear right out the other, it's not easy to parse that information for me. So if I fingerspell, I just do much better with actually getting the information in my head and then visualizing it. So it helps me process. Another study that looks at how autistic people sign, that is also extremely recent, 2023, only looks at it's a case study that looks at one native deaf autistic signer and how he uses language. And so some of the things that are interesting about the way he uses language is that he repeats a lot of his signs. So he'll sign the same thing over and over again a lot. And this is so interesting. It's important to note that he also has anxiety and OCD, things that are comorbid with autism that are commonly associated with autism, and particularly anxiety. I'm not entirely sure when to associate OCD, but I'm pretty sure that you're more likely to have OCD if you're autistic. But I digress somewhat. They theorize that maybe it's a self-soothing behavior that's helping him soothe himself, and which might come some distress. Maybe that might originate from his tendency to be anxious or from some symptoms of his OCD. But this also doesn't seem all that particularly likely. It's somewhat of a mystery as to why he repeats a lot of the signs. But anyways, that is one thing probably not as important for our purposes. But one thing that is interesting is how he fingerspells. He doesn't fingerspell normally. Signs like R in ASL, he would sign like this. He would not sign like this. This is how you sign R in sign language. He would sign it uncrossed, which actually is another sign. U. This is the sign for U, the letter U. Though he seems that they're still able to understand him. And also he might when fingerspelling, he might use his pinky. So if I'm signing L and I'm signing my pinky out, I mean, it would look like I'm signing I love you, right? Because that's the thing in ASL, right? Because this is I, L, this is Y. Combine all of them, you get this. And also the thing is, he seems to have a preference for fingerspelling, even though he's not, let's say, particularly good at it. and he actually fingerspells 50% faster than a study that looked at 8 native sounding adolescents, not autistic, neurotypical, from a 1991 study. So that's somewhat interesting. I mean, my friend Reese certainly was great at fingerspelling. I think I'm all right, but I guess it depends also how much you work on it. But yeah. ASL or sign language is an AAC. So when it comes to, so first of all, what is an ASAC? An AAC stands for augmentative alternative communication. And so it might, in the example for Stephen Hawking, he can't really speak, so he would type out his responses, and a computer would be able to articulate them so that other people can hear and actually know what he's saying, so he can communicate. Another example might be Hector Salamanca from that one scene in Breaking Bad, where he's telling the police something, and he's using an alphabet board and pointing to individual letters. Though AACs like that are tedious and might require partners to translate what you're saying, because at least in that Breaking Bad scene, she had to write out all of the letters and all the words, and it takes so long to spell all those words. There are also other systems that have been used for particularly like autistic children or other children who are disabled with language disorders, such as, I guess you might pronounce that as PECS, I've never heard it said, but PECS, Picture Exchange Communication System, in which you give a child multiple kind of pictures, and you by, I guess, basically training a child, you have them learn, or you Pavlov them a little bit. They learn that, oh, if I click on this icon, I get that item. And so that becomes a way of communication that is limited because it is multiple choice. And there are many other kind of AACs that might be found on things like iPads and such that are multiple choice and not infinite, which limits people's expressive abilities, right? They're not able to, really get everything that they could out of communication, right? You can't fully have social interaction, for example, if you can't express yourself to the level of a living language, as the French study put it, une langue vivante. But so that's one reason why you might want to look seriously consider ASL or sign language in general as an AAC. And also AACs can cost money, right? iPads cost money, I guess, right? But AACs can cost money, whereas sign languages theoretically cost no money, although you could argue that there's cost in time and learning an actual language, though you get benefits from being bilingual, as we've already discussed. So let's look at another article from 2020, still hella recent. This paper proposes a new translation system for sign language, although it is not really able to actually really translate ASL, for example, because it is just a glove, so it only fits on one hand, and additionally it's limited, so it can't, for the signs it can't get dynamic signs that have motion as part of the sign. But there are aspects about it, because even if it's not ASL, you can still use some signing as to create an AAC. So it would be relatively accessible, being it's just a Bluetooth glove that connects to a smartphone app. People probably already own a smartphone, they have to buy a smartphone. It's customizable, so you can input your own signs, and especially if it's signing that's just uses one hand and that doesn't have dynamic signs, we're probably not using established language like sign language, or like ASL, like American Sign Language. We are probably it's not like American Sign Language, it's going to be it is going to be the kinds of signs that were invented in a home-specific environment for unique communication needs. There's also additionally this function called scenarios, which, as we're talking about context, they basically function kind of like a loadout of some signs. And so then if I'm in a different context, I can switch to a different scenario, and then that'll basically switch to a new set of signs that'll comprehend. So that means that it's less likely to confuse similar signs. That's, I think, the main benefit from having that function. And then also for people who might have dyspraxia, because a lot of people who would be nonverbal have the reason why they're nonverbal is they have difficulty manipulating their body. And so for people who can't manipulate their body very well, who might have like a shaky hand, for example, they propose this kind of a deviance setting so that it can account for a level of deviance in the signs that it interprets, and therefore be more accurate and useful for those populations which might actually need an AAC as an alternative to speaking. And then this other paper proposes a different device, another possible AAC for sign language, and it is much more recent, 2023, not much more recent. The other one was only like 2020, I don't know, 3 years. But it is much more cumbersome because it has sensors that are installed at the head, the elbow, hands, and fingers. So that's fun, and it's somewhat tedious to put on, and not as much fun to put on. You can't have the freedom of expression such as I have, as much as you look lame with the thing on your head, maybe. But it would allow for the actual translation of ASL, for example, of actual sign languages that do utilize multiple aspects, such as fingers, elbow, and then position of the body position, because sign language does encompass all of those things as opposed to just one hand. That limits communication, or that limits the amount of language you can output. So, and they talk about also how other AACs or alternatives to translating sign language can be expensive, and interpreters are also expensive, can violate privacy to an extent, and also for deaf people, additionally, cochlear implants can be somewhat effective for like 10% of the users, a full 1 in 10 people. So, right, a translation system for actual sign language, right, not just kind of more basic signing that is only using one hand. And they say their accuracy gets around to 90%, and their highest accuracy score was 96, which are good numbers. In conclusion, how is sign language as a tool for people with language disorders? Well, from looking at all the information, it kind of looks like sign language isn't as useful as I might have hoped it would be for neurodivergent individuals. When it comes to as an AAC, or as for as a way for people with language disorders to express themselves, it doesn't seem particularly useful. One, you have to, first of all, need an alternative to speech, and that your body needs to actually be adept enough and capable enough to actually articulate and thus actually sign language, and also to prefer it to speaking. And then, even if you are that population that does have that use for sign language, regardless of your hearing status, even if you're hearing, no one can understand sign language. Very little people can understand sign language. So what are you gonna do? Hire an interpreter, or put a bunch of bulbs or something? I don't know how it works on your body. That might not be the most appealing option. That way might be effective for much more minority of those people with language disorders. I think the strongest point that I found was in creating comprehensible input. I really like the idea of simultaneous communication because it's somewhat similar to putting subtitles on a YouTube video. You might be speaking the same language you understand, but putting subtitles does ease the burden of interpreting, language, audio language, interpreting the audio. So I think that's pretty good. And additionally, you might think that there might be a little bit more bilingual literacy in sign language if we use simultaneous communication, because then children are effectively getting exposure to gestures that have much more of a defined meaning, and that would, I think, just help communication in general, and it would be beneficial for not just autistic people who might be worse at receptive comprehension, but also for neurotypical people, although it would be not as needed, maybe not as necessary, but it can still be helpful or beneficial in terms of some bilingual literacy. And then, of course, finally, it does have potential as a research tool, because it does teach us aspects about language disorders that otherwise wouldn't be studied as much, like DLD. If you're thinking, oh, it's a language disorder, so you would study the spoken language. Well, you wouldn't learn that people with DLD have coordination issues with their body. That would not be as well understood. So that is my presentation on sign language and neurodivergent people with language disorders. Hope you enjoyed. Click the like and not the subscribe button. You do not need more of this content. This is an academic channel. Hit that like button because it'd be neat. Preston out.